Так, ще раз всім вітання. Дякую, що приєдналися. Сьогодні наш другий вебінар з циклу вебінарів з психологами і психоаналітиками. І для початку хочу декілька слів сказати про Education USA. Education USA – це мережа державного департаменту. У нас можете вмикати мікрофончики. Це мережа державного департаменту. Складається понад 435 інформаційно-консультативних центрів в різних країнах світу. Ця мережа забезпечує промоцію вищої освіти в США серед студентів всього світу і пропонує точну, повну і актуальну інформацію про можливості навчання в вищих навчальних закладах США. Якщо у вас є питання стосовно вступу до США, програм обміну, фінансування освіти, вступу, тестів або інші питання, які стосуються вищої освіти США, ви можете звертатися за нашими контактами, які бачите на екрані, і ми з радістю вас проконсультуємо. Всі послуги є безкоштовними. І окрім цього, якщо ви зацікавлені в презентації для вашої аудиторії, для ваших учнів або колег, ми також з радістю можемо провести ці презентації. Нагадаю також, що одним з напрямків роботи Education USA є спеціальні проекти, які фінансуються Державним департаментом США і покликані підтримувати освіту в Україні під час війни та після її завершення. Тож сьогодні я рада вас вітати на другому вебінарі «Розуміння травми та попереджувальних ознак». І сьогодні новий експерт Рональдом Паломаресом-Фернандесом, доктор наук, доцент з Техаського жіночого університету, і Аннамарі ДеллаНебіа, докторантка цього університету. Я хочу з радістю їх привітати. Дякую, що ви сьогодні з нами, і хочу надати вам слово для сьогоднішньої презентації.
All right. Thank you very much. And we are very honored to have this opportunity to be here and to be able to share this information with you. We thank you for being here as well, taking the time out of your day to come in and learn about, as we're going to talk about, understanding trauma and the warning signs that we see in children. To begin our webinar today, I'd like to give you an idea of what we're going to be talking about. So first, we're going to do some introductions of ourselves, and with that, we're going to introduce who we are, and then move right into defining trauma. When we hear the word trauma, and when you probably saw that as one of the topics, it's I think everyone comes in with different ideas or different thoughts about what it is, and so we want to first define it so we're all looking at trauma in the same way. As we begin to understand what trauma is, then the next step that we'll take is really looking at what are those warning signs. What is it, the behaviors, the emotions, the things that we see in someone who is struggling with trauma. And then what we'd like to do is at the end provide you with some things that you can do when you start to see trauma with children. And at the end, we will then open it up for questions. So in doing this, we have this little mnemonic that we would like to help you remember some of the key points of what we're going to be talking about today. And so we have these numbers, 3, 4, 3. And as we move through the presentation, we're talking about some key points, 3 key points defining trauma, 4 key points when we look at the warning signs, and then 3 key points on what you can do based upon the information that you learned today. And so with that, we've got this just kind of reminder of this 3, 4, 3, and you'll see it as we move forward in the presentation. So who are we? My name is Dr. Palomarесом-Fernandesom, and I am an associate professor at Texas Women's University. I've been a licensed psychologist for over 28 years. I've been teaching at the university for 14 years, but I've also engaged in a number of direct services. I had the opportunity to provide clinical psychological services to U.S. service members and their families between 2007 and 2013, working both here in the United States and also in Germany. Right after the earthquakes in 2014 in Nepal, I went for 5 weeks working with children and adolescents with the trauma and the issues that they were struggling with after those devastating earthquakes. I did some training for teachers, nurses, and midwives in Juba in South Sudan about trauma, working with them to understand what trauma is and being able to share that information with their colleagues. And presently, I work in a long-term care facility on a part-time basis, as well as teaching full-time, where I'm working with individuals with an older population that have, many of them have trauma in their past. And now my colleague, Anna.
Hello, everyone. My name is Anna DelLaNebia, and I'm a school psychology doctoral student at Texas Women's University. My background, though, is in counseling psychology. And I have some experience working with adults, children, adolescents, and even families doing trauma-specific care, individual therapy, as well as group work, so process groups, psychoeducation groups, and social skills groups as well.
So moving back to why we're here today and what we're going to be talking about, we have this term trauma. And when we think about trauma, I think many of us have our own idea, our definition, what we think of it, what it means. And so what I wanted to do was first start off and talk about trauma itself. So we have the same idea. We know what we have, the same common ground. There's a lot of different definitions out there. So even it's like what you might think about it, what someone else might think about it. What we find in the professional literature, when professionals begin to talk about trauma, there's a lot of different definitions as well. For example, the one you see on the slide in front of you is a very short, simple definition. Trauma is a powerful emotional response to a distressing event. And I think that really does cover trauma in a very, very broad manner. But what we'd like to do is look at it more specifically. And here in the United States, one of our federal organizations have come together and they brought an expert group to really look at trauma and talk about it. And what they did was develop this definition, the definition you see in front of you, of what trauma is. And it's actually become a very common term or definition for the term trauma that is being used as we move forward in our research. And I think it's really important to see it. So I want to read it to you. And so you really hear what this definition is. So trauma is individual trauma results from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has long-lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. And so when you see that, when you hear that definition, it's a broad definition with some very specific pieces to it. And so our first piece to it, and if you remember, we talked about the number 343. Here's our first 3. It's the event, experience, and effect. And so with this broad definition that has these details within it, there's really 3 key points that I'd like you to remember on that really tie into what trauma is. So trauma is those events. And it's the events that someone experiences And then it's the effects that come about for that individual based upon their experience of the event. So looking at that a little bit closer, when we look at trauma events, the events could be something that is just one time, or it could be this a one-time event, one-time occurrence, or this threat. But it also could be several times events that repeat over time. And when we think about an event, always have to define these things. Event could be from war, natural disasters, violence, severe life-threatening neglect of a child that restricts their healthy development. So thinking about that definition of an event, it can be that single thing, or it can be an accumulation of occurring in an event, or that threat of harm. So in putting this together, we were talking about it, Anna and I, about what might be a good example of an event. And the thing that we came up with was think about the event of moving, moving from one place where you're one home to a new home.
Юнічка, а є тут переклад?
And when we think about moving, sometimes it's a very joyful event, moving from one house or one home to a new one. But there's also, it could be a distressing event, or it could be a traumatic event based upon what causes that movement. For many individuals, you may have moved from your homes because of war. You may have moved because of changes in family. And that could be very traumatic as well for some individuals, and maybe not for others. And so as we begin to talk about that, we look at the experience. So that experience and how that impacts trauma, or how it becomes traumatic for one person, is really how that person experiences the event. So something that may be traumatic for one person may not be traumatic for another person. For example, a move. For one person, a move might be a very exciting, joyful event. And that for another person, that same move can be very traumatic. And we find that how the individual experiences trauma or not can be influenced, it can be compacted by their previous experiences, the actual perception of threat and harm, and that resilience and support that they have. So keeping with this example about moving, if an individual has moved other times, they may find that a move, let's say they've moved several times in their life, and it was because a change in location, change in jobs, a variety of reasons for that. And then they have to move because of war. Even though that could be very traumatic, for an individual who's experienced previous moves may not find it to be traumatic because they've had that experience of many moves in their lives. Whereas for another person who has to move because of war may find that it is very traumatic because they haven't had previous experiences with it, and because there's this perception of threat or harm. So we find that what one person experiences as trauma may not be the same for another person. The exact same experience may not be traumatic for them. When we have this event, and the individual experiences it as traumatic for them, our last part is, how does it affect them? What do we see happening because of the experience and because of that event? And for those things, I'm going to turn it over to Anna in just a moment, and she'll talk about what those effects are. But we know that these effects, for some individuals, occur right away, that immediately during and after the event, we begin to see many of these warning signs, the effects of the trauma. But for other individuals, we also see that they may not show any signs. They may just persevere. They may just move forward. They're able to do everything. And then a couple of days later, a week later, a month later, it seems like all of a sudden it hits them. And now we begin to see these warning signs, these behaviors, these thoughts that are occurring. And for, again, another aspect of that is that we may see where for one individual it occurs in a very short time, those effects, and then goes away. For another person, they may have these effects and they continue to last time after time after time. So what are these effects? What are the things that we're talking about? I'm going to turn it over to Anna, and she'll talk about that to you, share that with you now.
Thank you, Ron, for that great description of what trauma is. So now that we know a little bit about what comprises trauma, we're going to talk about the warning signs that we can see in our students, children, adolescents. One thing that's important to note is that even though individuals might go through similar traumatic experiences, they might not be able to express what they're going through. This could be not having the words, or this could be maybe the individual doesn't feel safe or comfortable expressing what they're feeling. So we might see areas of change in these 4 primary areas that we're going to discuss about trauma impacting. And this is where the 4 comes in, our 3-4-3. So the first primary area of change is going to be mood changes. This could be how the individual feels on the inside. So their emotional reactions that also have outward expressions of those emotions. So we'll dive into a few examples of that. Next are some cognitive changes, and this is where our teachers in the academic setting can be incredibly helpful about shining light on some of their differences in learning and memory and how that looks post-trauma. Another area that we might see warning signs are social changes, how they're engaging with their families, their peers, their friends after they went through this traumatic experience. And lastly, developmental changes. And one thing that is important to note with the developmental changes are these aren't changes that are typical growth changes. These are changes that are beyond that normal developmental trajectory that we would expect. This big alteration that they are displaying after the trauma. So the 4 primary areas that we're going to discuss warning signs in are mood, cognitive, social, and developmental changes. The first area is mood changes. And one big warning sign of mood changes is the presence of anxiety that wasn't there before the trauma. And usually when we think about anxiety, the first thing that comes to mind is worry. How might worry look? This could be concerns about the future. Often when there is that worry, that's very concerned about the future, it's about the safety that was taken away from them, that experience of the security's gone after the trauma. So you can see concerns, worries about their own personal safety, as well as the safety of those that they care about. So families, friends, neighbors, even emergency service providers or people in the military, there might be concern and worry about what's going to happen next to them. The anxiety might also present as fear. This could be reactivity to loud sounds that wasn't there before, or they're easily startling. They're having these big reactions, or they could have specific phobias, specific fears that are related to their traumatic experience. The anxiety might also present in a somatic way. So how their body looks, they could appear more tense. As I just showed, you can see the shoulders maybe going up closer to their ears. Their bodies might appear tighter. Maybe sitting in class, you see the thumbs rolling or the foot that's always tapping. That can be a somatic presentation, a physical presentation of how they're manifesting that anxiety. So if there's anxiety that wasn't there before the trauma, that can be a big warning sign that they're struggling to process and express the stress reaction that they're experiencing. We can also see mood changes related to depression. And typically when we think about depression, the sadness is what comes to mind. And this can look like prolonged crying, for example. Maybe an individual, once they are crying, they're unable to be soothed. It's happening for an extended period of time, or they struggle to get that emotional regulation once they experience the prolonged crying. But it can also look a little bit differently. So consider children, for example. You might see changes in their play. And imagine a younger child who doesn't have the language to tell you what's going on. Their experiences and the traumatic stress that they're holding might be expressed in how they engage with toys and how they play. So you might see themes, morbid themes. So things like death, harm, assault, sickness, things of those natures being presented in the play because they're trying to express what they're going through without using the words. Now, our older students, our adolescents particularly, it might look differently. So this could be things like rule breaking and risk taking. You might have a student who is staying out past curfew or running away from home. You might have them doing dangerous things that they previously would have been, this is dangerous, I'm not doing that. But now, for example, they might be jumping off things that are high or things that would be considered a little bit more risky. You could also see things like smoking, substance abuse, alcohol consumption. And again, as previously noted, this isn't our typical developmental normalcy. This is something that post-trauma is beyond that. When you ask yourself, is this normal? If the answer is no, that's a warning sign. And that could be how the sadness and depression is presenting. Next, our depression could look like hopelessness. And this is a very big warning sign because hopelessness often goes hand in hand with suicidality. And we know that suicidality increases for individuals who have gone through traumatic events, that there's a rise in suicidality oftentimes. So if we hear an individual who is having any discussion, any comments of suicidal thoughts, behaviors, we need to make note of that. That could look like a conversation. It could look like a comment or in written and writing assignments, even social media posts. That's something that needs to be taken very seriously, as does any sense of hopelessness. So what's the point? The future is going to be the same. There's no desire to think about going to college or even plans for the summer because it's always going to be bad. Why would I bother? Why would I try? That hopelessness is a big red flag to look out for, as is that suicidality that often goes with that. And lastly, another thing to look out for with depression is that blunted affect. So instead of the prolonged crying, that expression, instead of the hopelessness that we might see, we're not really getting much nonverbal communication of emotions. So their faces are flat. They might seem like they're floating from one situation to the next, just going through the motions. They're not as responsive to environmental stimuli or other things that are surrounding them. And think of why that might be. It might be a protective measure. In an effort to protect themselves from the trauma that they went through and other potential traumatic experiences, they're protecting themselves. They have this wall of numbness that they're projecting because it's easier than feeling the sadness that they're experiencing. So if we see any of that sadness, hopelessness, or blunted affect, that can be a warning sign of the depression and the mood changes. So the next area that we might see impacted post-trauma is cognitive. And as previously noted, this is where our teachers can really shine and give us some information about what's going on and how they're learning. So attention changes is one area that we could see a warning sign post-trauma. And usually when we think about inattention, we think about the child who is struggling to focus on the information, the task at hand. They are focusing on what's happening here, 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 every stimulus they're attending to. And that's how it can look post-trauma. The only difference is, was this here before or after the trauma experience only? If it was there before, it can be less of a warning sign, but if it's a change, that's something to make note of. They might suddenly appear distracted. You might see more fidgeting. So that hyperactivity, inability to stay seated, they're moving always in their seat. They're more fidgeting. They're struggling to stay still. That extra motor movement can be a sign of that issue with attention. It can also present as poor organization. So this is the student who, before their desk looked completely organized, they were able to find things, and now it looks like a storm has gone through there. They can't find their assignments. They can't find the tools that they need to complete tasks. They're forgetting things and losing things. They're leaving things at home because that organization is disrupted. We might also see impulsivity. So the acting without thinking can be a reflection of issues with attention. Another cognitive change that we might see post-trauma is learning and memory changes. And first and foremost, our teachers can really help us by indicating if there are any changes in their grades. So if we have a previously B student who starts making C's, D's, and failing assignments, that's a big red flag that something's changed, that they're struggling to deal with what they've gone through. But it could also look a little bit differently. It could look like the need to repeat instructions. This can either be the student is requesting you to repeat the instructions, or it could be you deliver the instructions and you can tell that they have no idea what they're being asked to do. So you find yourself repeating those instructions because they're struggling to process the information that was delivered to them. They might also need re-exposure to previously taught information. So you might find yourself reteaching often. They might be referring back to their notes because they don't remember what came up in a lesson earlier in the day or earlier in the week. They weren't able to store it in their long-term memory because there was that learning and memory deficit post-trauma with how their brains are processing information. They might need extra time to complete tasks. For example, if they're doing an in-class assignment, by the end of the class, you might see that it's only halfway completed. They may be needing to go back to their notes, or they may be struggling with that in attention. They might just rush through and circle all the bubbles on the multiple choice. Those are some signs that there are some cognitive effects to the trauma that they experienced, and this is how it's presenting. The third area of warning signs are social changes. And again, this is where our school atmospheres can really shine because they are a social location. There are interactions with so many others. So for some individuals post-trauma, you might see withdrawal. So this is a student who goes into themselves and holds on to all of those experiences and reactions that they're going through. This could look like less communication. They might be having fewer interactions, or the interactions may be more brief. So yes, no, sure, okay. And again, this isn't just a teenager normal development. This is a consistent pattern that wasn't there before the trauma. Prior to the trauma, they were able to engage. They had their friends that they were interacting with. They came to the teacher for help, but now they're inside themselves. And this might be because they don't have the words to express what's going on. They don't feel safe. They're holding something very heavy and they don't want to burden other people. So they want to hold on to it themselves. They don't want to be a bother. That could be the reaction that we see in our students. And unfortunately, because we are social beings as humans, when we withdraw into ourselves, this can lead to loneliness, sense of feeling that they're the only one going through this. And as Ron had mentioned, two individuals can be in the same traumatic experience, but have different reactions. So imagine what a student may be going through if they see the student to their right and the student to their left presenting as perfectly fine when they're holding all these heavy emotions and having these big reactions. That maybe that sense that I'm all alone and I don't want to say this because I'm embarrassed or I don't have the words or it's just me. So that can lead to that loneliness. With our withdrawal, we might also see diminished trust. So they might have a suspicious attitude or that lack of trust in others. One, because it's very vulnerable to share these big feelings, and that requires a lot of trust, but it also might be their safety was disrupted. And trusting other people with their security and their safety, it can be scary. So we might see that lack of trust post-trauma that wasn't there beforehand. So on one side of our social changes, we can see the withdrawal when they go into themselves. But on the other end of our social changes, we can see the outward expression of their experiences. And this can present as hostility and anger. So it's really common to see that in verbal aggression after trauma. This could take the form of yelling, harsh tones and greater volume in the way they communicate with others. They're getting in more arguments with their peers, with adults, people in power, parents, teachers. Before, they were able to compromise, they were able to communicate, but now there's this amplification in that hostility towards others. And it can also take the form of physical violence. This could look like fighting, and think about how that physical violence might look different across ages. So for our youngers, this might be pinching or pushing. And for our olders, this might be like punching, getting into serious fights. But it can also look like bullying before that wasn't present before the trauma, that bullying is there now, or disruption of property. So the student who is carving on their desk or spray painting graffiti or even starting fires. And one thing to make note of with that aggression and physical violence is this could be aggression towards others, but it could also be harm to self and aggression towards self. That can be there as well. So if you see any type of aggression, that can be a big warning sign if it is manifesting post-trauma. So on the social changes, we have the spectrum of withdrawal, them going back into themselves, and the outward expression of aggression on the other end of the spectrum. And the fourth area of warning signs that we're going to talk about today are developmental changes. So oftentimes when we see an individual who's gone through a traumatic experience, sometimes their development can appear to be frozen and not really progressing forward. And we're gonna talk about how that might look. There can be issues with attachment. So attachment is how they're connecting with those caregivers, those people that they're supposed to be connected to, parents, peers, family members. And you might have a student who in the past was confident. They were always raising their hands, answering questions. They were able to make decisions. But now there's a greater need for dependency. They're relying on an external source to reassure them that they are okay. They might be needing their peers to check things. They might not be raising their hands so much in class anymore. But that greater dependency on an external source to reassure them that they are capable, that they are right, that things are okay, that might be there. They may also start carrying comfort items that they weren't carrying before the trauma. So this could be a blanket or a pacifier, or for our older students, maybe something in their pocket like a piece of fabric or I don't know, a rabbit's foot, some sort of external object that's bringing them that sense of everything is okay. That helps them have that emotional regulation that they're no longer able to do on their own. They need that outside assistance to regulate. And lastly, there could be issues with separation when we think about attachment issues. So this could be the child who has the meltdown at drop-off when their parents bring them to school. Or it could be once they're comfortable in school and have that attachment with their teacher, they don't want to leave. They may struggle with transitions between classes or between teachers, as well as having big reactions to substitutes. Any sort of change that disrupts that consistency can be an issue that we see with attachment post-trauma. And regression, it's not when the individual is frozen and doesn't move forward in their development, but regression is when the individual goes backwards. Previously mastered tasks are falling by the wayside. So we're starting to see more childlike behaviors be presented that previously were not there, which can be a big red flag about a developmental change going on post-trauma. And this may look like thumb sucking, toileting accidents, whereas before they were able to go to the restroom when they needed. Now they're having accidents either during the day, or parents may be mentioning bedwetting, issues staying dry at night. Those can come up as a regressive symptom of trauma. We can also see changes in communication. So this can look like the student who stops talking, that mutism that can come. This could look like the student who begins leading the parent or the caregiver, taking them by the hand and pointing to what they need, relying on nonverbal communication. It could also be an individual who continues talking, but uses more childlike language that they previously did, or a more childlike tone. Any sort of changes in how they're communicating their needs with others can be a sign of a regressive of regression. So that's a developmental change to make note of. And as mentioned previously in these slides, these aren't our normal developmental trend. This is something that's different, that was different post-trauma. So you can ask yourself, is this normal? Is this what I expected? Was this how they were before? And if the answer to those questions is no, that's a warning sign that there is something deeper going on with the trauma. And that student might need some assistance overcoming what they're experiencing, helping them manage and regulate themselves post-trauma. So I just threw a lot of warning signs at you guys really, really quickly. So I wanted to make sure that we had a moment to go over the key warning signs. So if you're a teacher in a classroom, if you are anyone who wants to make note of these warning signs, this is the time to write down these 5 warning signs. And the first one is that worry, that future orientation, that greater need for reassurance, what's going to happen next that wasn't there before. They're worried about their safety. That's a big warning sign to make note of. And if you see that in a student, that can be a sign that they need a hand overcoming what they're experiencing. The next key warning sign is talk about suicide. And as we noted, this goes hand in hand with that sense of hopelessness. What's the point? The future's never going to be brighter. I don't really care about what's going to happen next because I can't change it. So if you hear any comments like that, any themes in their writings, social media posts, any mention of suicidality, that's something to be taken very seriously. And in a moment, we'll talk about what we can do next if we see some of those warning signs. The third key warning sign is related to social behaviors. So if we see the individual who is hiding in their room, not engaging at recess, not talking to their peers or parents, teachers, that's a big red flag that they're struggling with a lot that they don't feel comfortable expressing to others. So they're holding it on to it themselves. So if we see an individual who isn't engaging with others, that's a big red flag. And on our other end of our social changes, if we start to see a person who is easily angered, who's getting into the fights, who starts bullying, who starts having that verbal or physical aggression, that's another big red flag that we need to take seriously. And lastly is the regression. We typically do not see regression unless there's something going on. So if we start to see those previously mastered behaviors start to disappear, if we start to see the child thumb sucking, having toileting accidents, that's something that is a big red flag to something deeper going on. And we need to take the next steps on that. And for those next steps, I'm going to pass it off to Ron, who's going to talk about what we can do if we see these warning signs.
Well, thank you, Anna. And so as you've heard about these warning signs, I think, and Anna's talked about it at the very beginning, I want to reiterate, these are the behaviors, these are things that you see that occur that are different for the student or for the individual. When we look at the worry, we have some children who are just very anxious, that are just constantly worrying about things. And so when you see a child who's worrying, that question may come up, is there some trauma going on has there been some trauma in the past? But more so is when you begin to see a child or a student that you have or someone that you know that in the past was not a worrier or did not get angry very easily or did not withdraw, was more isolated. And all of a sudden you see these warning signs appear. You see them starting to do these things. That's when we begin to say, we question, is there something that has gone on? Have they experienced trauma? Or you may know of a traumatic event or expected event that is traumatic. And now you see these behaviors in someone who suffered through that. then we start to say, begin to think, yes, this person is impacted by the trauma. They have been in a traumatic event. So what can you do now? What is it that you can take to support your students? What actions? And our first one is going to be the one that we always talk about, and it's direct them to whatever local mental health services are available. We are not expecting you as a teacher to be the psychologist or the counselor or the person who can take over and help them through all of this unless you have that additional training. But there are those individuals who have that additional training, in the community, the mental health providers, the psychologists, the social workers, the psychiatrists, the counselors. Refer them to those resources. And so one of the things I would ask, and I would expect and hope that you already know what some of those resources are in your community, but finding those. So when you see these warning signs, especially that the suicidality, that hopelessness, the depression, when you see that occurring, those behaviors, those warning signs in an individual, the first step is to get them to that help where they can get the support and the direction that they need. But as having worked in schools, knowing that we can make those referrals, and parents and their providers oftentimes will reach out and follow up on that. Oftentimes those students are going to still show up in your classroom the next day and the next day and the next day. And you know that they have this traumatic experience, or you're seeing these warning signs. And so what can you do as a teacher? And that's our second action that we offer, is as a classroom. When for many of you as teachers, you may find that a majority of your classroom students have suffered through some traumatic event, or are experiencing trauma. You may be seeing these warning signs in many of your students in your classroom. And so as a whole, one of the things that we have found that's effective and helpful and supportive are these expressive activities. And you may be asking, what's an expressive activity? Well, it's something very straightforward and simple, and based upon the age, the grade of your students, finding out what fits most appropriately for your students that you serve. It could be having the class as a whole do a drawing exercise, just having them draw something. In that part, having them draw. Moving on, having them write a story, or maybe create a poem. Those type of activities where they can express themselves. What this does is it allows them to take the experience, the trauma, the struggles that they're having internally, and be able to actually put it out in paper, or put it in a story, or put it in writing, being able to get it out. And we find that for individuals who have had a traumatic experience, being able to find some way to express it, some way to get it out from just being held inside, thinking about it, reimagine it over and over. Being able to share it is one of those ways of releasing some air from that balloon, the balloon of trauma. It releases that air, it releases that tension, and it helps with that relief. But we also know that at times you may find that there's a particular student. There's that one student who has gone through a traumatic event, or you're seeing all these warning signs. You're seeing them that you've known the students, and now they begin to isolate more. Their grades, they may have been an average student, and now they start to, they're not turning in assignments, they're failing. You start to see many of these warning signs that Anna talked about and described. What can you do as a teacher with this one student? And what we would recommend, or what we do recommend, is to provide that safe connection. What's a safe connection? It's listening. It's listening, just being there, and allowing that student to talk and share those emotions. You don't have to do anything with what you hear other than being supportive and letting them know you hear them. But it's that part of knowing that they have that one person, they have you, an adult, who is going to sit and listen to them as they share what they've struggled with or what they're worried about or what's going on. You don't have to solve any of those problems for them. Just the fact that you're listening is the piece that allows them that ability to, again, let some of that air out of this traumatic event, let some of that struggle, that worry, that the things that they're holding inside so tightly, being able to express it, being able to share it and express it in a safe place is critical. That's that first step of just kind of helping to let that piece out. And so you as a teacher, I think it's critical that you know these individuals, you know your students, and they know you. They look up to you, they respect you, and being that safe person who they know that they can actually talk about something. For a student at home with their family, oftentimes they find that it's hard to share some of this information, some of these worries, some of these struggles that they have with either a brother or a sister or a parent. They may be seeing their parents going through the same type of struggles that they have. And so they don't want to burden them. They don't want to share this with them. So having a where you're that safe place, that safe connection. So with that, we have our 3 actions that you can take. The first one is directing them to services that can provide that direct help for an individual who has suffered through trauma. But then the other 2 are the ones that you can take directly, looking at a group or a classroom, doing some of these expressive activities and allowing them that opportunity to put it out there. Or for the individual, being that safe connection, just listening, be that listener. So with that, we have a lot of key points, several key points. We have our 3-4-3, our definition. And in that definition, we have the event, the experience, and the effect. When we think about trauma, it's what was the event? How did the individual experience it? And based upon the event and those experiences, what happens after that? What's the effect on them? What do we see? And the things that we see are those warning signs. And there's our 4, the 4 impacted areas. We see those warning signs where it's impacting them in their mood, depression, or that anxiety. We're seeing that impacting them on their cognitions, on what they're thinking, the thought processes. We see the impact in the social area, that withdrawal, or they become very angry and aggressive. And finally, we see that impact in their development, where at times they may be pulling back or withdrawing. So those are those 4 impacted areas where we see the effects of trauma. And then we have the 3 things that we offer for you to do. The first one is making that referral, getting them help with the resources in the community, those things that are local. The second is in those groups, allowing them that expression, some outlet to where they can write things, a story, a picture, share things as a group, just letting it out. And then that third one of those 3 ways that you can help is being that connection, being that listener. And I want to close on this note. I think it's really important when we think about it, of everything that we've talked about. I think that last thing that you can do is being that listener is most important, being that safe place for them just to share with, because in the outcome of it, listening is really the greatest gift that you as a teacher can provide to them, being someone who they can talk to. And so with that, we thank you for your time and for listening to us and sharing and being there with us. We'd like to open it up for questions.
Дуже дякую, Роналд і Анна, за чудову презентацію, цікавий матеріал. Шановні учасники, якщо у вас є запитання, можете підняти ручку, задати запитання українською мовою, так, і наші експерти нададуть свою думку, свою експертну відповідь на ваше запитання.
Доброго дня, у мене є запитання. Але якщо потрібно, я можу і англійською.
Ні, все добре, можна українською, щоб не переключатися на канали різні.
Просто я англійську знаю, то мені немає такої великої проблеми. У мене таке запитання. Як ми можемо допомогти реабілітуватися дітям, от які були в цій ситуації, наприклад, переселенцям? Тобто діти, які були безпосередньо в зоні бойових дій і переїхали от на нашу територію, де бойових дій немає. Як ми можемо допомогти їм влитися в колектив, можливо, дітей? Тому що у мене, наприклад, в мене 2 клас. І це така досить проблемна ситуація, коли дитина приходить з іншої території і їй досить важко влитися в цей колектив.
Thank you. That's a really good question. How can you help those that have had to that have struggled with things and have had to relocate? I think one of the most important pieces in being there for them is stability, having a routine, developing routines that keep consistency, having something that it's like, this is what we do every morning when students come in. We do the same thing over and over. Because when we see the relocation, when we see trauma, oftentimes what it does is it impacts our view of the world. We felt safe, we felt secure, life was quote normal. And then all of a sudden this event happens and it throws us into chaos and we don't know what to expect. It's like I start to feel like we're normal again, but I'm always afraid that something else is going to happen or that it's going to happen again. And so one of the first things that can really be helpful for children and for adults is getting that routine, setting things up to where it's back to some level of stability. These are the things that are going to, that they can expect, because when we get our world shaken from a traumatic event, at times it's that question, well, what next? What's going to happen next? Is it going to happen again, or is something different going to happen? And that questioning, but knowing that, but this is a Monday, this is what we do on Mondays. We always do the same thing. Developing those relationships with the people around them and having stability is one of the first things that can be done to help.
Так, дуже дякую. У нас є декілька запитань в чаті. Можливо, якщо у когось є запитання, хто хоче підняти руку і сказати, це можна зробити зараз, або тоді ми перейдемо до запитань в чаті. На початку у нас було запитання стосовно попереджувальних ознак, що це таке і як зрозуміти це визначення. Я сподіваюся, шановні учасники, що зараз, в принципі, при кінці презентації вже зрозуміло, так, що таке попереджувальні ознаки і як вони саме виглядають, і що ви можете зробити, якщо побачили якісь ознаки ці у ваших учнів. Запитання в чаті, що ви можете порадити для допомоги діткам зовсім малого віку, які ще не говорять або погано говорять, які з 3 методів, чи може щось інше?
Would you like to take this or?
I think in addition to the consistency that brings them that sense of security, that's really important. I think with our younger children who may not have that internal emotional regulation, they might need a little bit more hands-on assistance. So they might need more of the metaphorical or literal pat on the back, some of that reassurance that things are going to be okay. This might be giving the child a hug. This might be giving some physical outside regulation assistance. This might be dimming the lights to where they're able to have less stimulation and be a little bit more calm and secure. There can be a number of strategies that can be helpful with our younger students. If there's anything you want to add, Ron?
Yes, as Anna said, I think with those very young children who may not have the words or are able to express things, it's really, again, I'm going to come back to that stability of that routine of doing things the same way, but as well as what Anna was saying is making those connections, holding and hugging, finding ways to just reassure them in a way that they feel safe. So it is that pat on the back, on that telling them they're doing a good job. It is spending that moment. One of my last points was listening. And with very young children who are not able to talk or communicate very well, it's actually just being there with them in the moment when they're playing or engaging with toys or something, that you're in the moment with them, playing with them, which is the same as listening. It's making that connection that they know you care about them. And having that, knowing that an adult cares about you for a child becomes such a safe place. And that's that piece that we see individuals who become more resilient, know that they have someone that they can turn to. They may not actually turn to them, but they know that they have someone. Those individuals who feel like they don't have an adult in their life that they can turn to, that they can just hold their hand or can listen to them or be there with them, those that don't have that are the ones who struggle the most. And so for you as a teacher, ensuring that you're making those personal connections with each of your students. And I know you do that. That's part of teaching, but it's also being there for them. Thank you.
Дуже вам дякую за таку змістовну відповідь. Наступне запитання в чаті. Можливо, якісь є поради, як заспокоїти студента, учня, у якого був травматичний досвід, але сталася ситуація в класі, яка повернула цей досвід так назад. Да? Тобто і необхідно це зробити прямо, можливо, на уроці, я не знаю, так, або в класі. Заспокоїти.
Would you like to take this? Or?
Sure. So whenever an individual has gone through trauma, certain stimuli, sounds, smells can remind them of that trauma that they went through and can be very triggering and lead to an experience of flashbacks, like they're back in that moment. So when we have an individual or a class that's going through this, it's really important to bring them back to the present moment where they're at. And we talk about grounding techniques that associate them to the environment and establish that this is a safe place. We're not back in that trauma. Everything is secure right now, and reestablishing that sense of safety that they're craving because they're triggered. They feel like they're back in that moment, physically and mentally. So we talk about a few different types of grounding techniques, anything that reassociates them to the environment. This could be taking deep breaths. This could be noticing 5 things that they see in the room, some things that they smell. Talking about some of someone who's there who might support them, what that might look like, anything to reorient them to the environment, remind them that they are supported either physically by, for example, the chair that they're sitting on, that physical, do you feel the support from the chair? Do you feel the support from the people in the room? Anything that can reestablish that grounding calmness, that everything is okay right now, we're not back in that trauma, can be really helpful in the moment. Is there anything you'd like to add?
I think that's exactly it. It's that grounding. So as a teacher, if you have a student who is disruptive, I think it is, let's stop the whole class. Let's focus on where we are at the moment, and take that time out. Also, a lot of what we've talked about, we make that connection, and you hear and you understand the connection between the trauma and that experience with what they're doing, the behaviors. But for the individual themselves, for the student, many times or most times, they don't understand it. They just have the feeling or that emotion. It just overwhelms them. It just takes over. And they may not even connect it to the trauma or the experience. They just know right now, I'm just feeling really lonely and really isolated, and I don't want to be around people. And that's that feeling. And it's not, they're not able to say, and this is something new because of the trauma. It's there in the moment. This is what I'm feeling. And so understanding that these are you may see them experience these raw, fresh emotions and behaviors that they don't connect it to that. And so we can, part of that grounding is bringing them back to the present and saying, here's where we are, here's what's going on now, let's move forward with the lesson, and acknowledging it, but then moving them forward.
Дякую. У нас є також запитання в чаті, яке звучить як які відновні практики можуть бути рекомендовані для старшокласників. Можливо, частина вже відповіді прозвучала, так, але можливо, якісь ще доповнення можуть бути також.
So with teenagers.
Okay. Can you repeat, are we talking about interventions or warning signs with the teenagers?
Скоріш за всього, що можна зробити, які вправи, так, як відновитися старшокласнику, так, підлітку?
I think going back to the expressive activities, allowing them to draw or write, or tell their story. I think it's that part of giving them that, teenagers are better able to do, write a poem or write a story, than rather just having them just draw a picture. It allows them that they're more expressive. They can be, there's opportunities to express things more. Also, I think it comes, I mean, no matter what age, I think it's that part is just listening. And when you see the warning signs with a teenager, teenagers are struggling with so much in their lives. Everyone does. But I think for teenagers, they feel things much stronger than at any other point in our lives. The emotions are much more deeper, much stronger. And I think they need that connection. They need to know they have that safe person who they can share things with. And and so many times that's you as a teacher who is that safe connection, because they may feel like their parents don't know them, they don't understand them. There's this separation of that connection with parents during their teen years, and yet having an adult, having someone who is there who can listen to them, providing some guidance, but more so just being safe that can hear them, becomes a critical piece. So I would say with teenagers, remembering what they're struggling with, just their body, the physical body, the changes, the hormones, the feelings, the deep feelings that they have, the deep thoughts that they have now, their ability to see the world in a new way, seeing the bigger picture in the world. And trauma throws in this whole new wrench or this whole new thing for them that they never expected. And teenagers also trying to bridge that gap between sometimes I want to be a child and taken care of, and most of the time I want to be an adult and do everything on my own. And trauma can really hold them back. It's like, well, but being an adult or doing things on my own is very scary. And so understanding those. So working with teenagers, it's that challenge of many other things that are happening for them in development across, I mean, no matter who they are, where they are. And so I think it's more important of having, just being that connection, being that safe person.
Right. And as Ron noted, during the teenage years, the peer relationships start to become pivotal. They still want the connection with the adults, but their peers and their friends are really important. So this might look like a teacher who organizes a small group with a few students who seem to be struggling, who are connected. Maybe they're having lunch together in the classroom with just a few students, a small group setting. Or after school, there might be a small group, some way that they can further develop those peer connections and that sense of support with a teacher there who's there to help guide them, to be that adult figure who's also present. And another expressive activity that's really great, especially with our teenagers, our younger kids love it too, but our teenagers can really enjoy music. And so expressive activities with music can also be another route that's really helpful. Maybe they find certain songs that they really relate to, or maybe they play the guitar or the drums. Maybe they can do things together in like a band, any way that can foster that connection in conjunction with that expression of what they're going through can be extra helpful for those teenagers.
And I saw a note in the chat come up, and I didn't see who wrote it, but it said, love heals everything. And it really is true. It is that showing that you love and you care about them. And ultimately, when that comes through, it does help. That does heal. Thank you for that chat.
Дуже дякую. Я тоді, з вашого дозволу, перейду до запитання, яке також стосується підлітків, а потім повернусь до ще одного. Запитання було таке, як насправді тоді зрозуміти, якщо у підлітків такий важкий період в житті, і тут накладується ще й травматичний досвід, пов'язаний з війною, як зрозуміти, що це саме їх процес дорослішання, а не травма, яка пов'язана з війною?
It's a very good question. I'm not sure how much we can separate it at times, because those emotions and the physical development and the changes that they go through as a teenager, as an adolescent, is, for some individuals, is traumatic itself. And then you throw in the war, you throw in their viewpoints of the world, the experiences that they've had, other forms of trauma that they may experience and suffer from. I think it's not so much as separating it out. It's really seeing what they're doing, how they're presenting, and focusing on those behaviors, those warning signs, whether those warning signs are coming from normal puberty and development, or from the experiences and the trauma that they've experienced. I think it still comes back to, when we see these warning signs, when we see these changes in behaviors, it's how do we help and support them? How do we get them the help and support that they need? How do we provide that love and caring that they need at that time?
Дуже вам дякую. Також в чаті прозвучало декілька запитань, які пов'язані з дітьми з особливими потребами. Шановні учасники, з вашого дозволу, я просто поясню, що у нас будуть вебінари саме за цією тематикою, да, тому сьогодні ми не будемо на них зупинятися. А ще перейдемо до двох запитань, і тут вже такі більш ситуативні, скажімо, запитання від пані Наталі. Коли у дитини проскакують російські слова, бо він жив на Сході, інші діти починають обзивати. Як запобігти ще одній травмі у дитини?
This is a different type of question for us. It's that how do we when we identify a bullying situation, when we identify a victim of bullying, how do we help support them? I'm thinking. I mean, first the part is we often see children engage in bullying activities when someone is different, when the victim is perceived as different. And as you were talking, what I heard in your question was, here we have a student, a child who speaks Russian, and so because of that, there's a lot tied into that bullying because they're different, but yet there's also, with the hostilities, there's some aggression that comes natural because of the hostilities. How do we support that child, and how do we support the bullying? I think first is helping the victim. Helping the victim by trying to think of what to say. Do you have some thoughts?
There's a few ways that we can support the victim. It depends on what their reactions to it are. Always that listening ear, always being there to know that this is not appropriate, and this is going to be addressed. How it is addressed by the school, by the teacher, that's going to look different in every school. There's going to be typically some sort of response that they have, be it going to the principal's office or some sort of after school detention, talking to the parents, whatever that might look like. But in the school, I think recognizing for the victim and for the bullies that this is not appropriate, this is not okay, and being there to support the victim, because when we experience stress, we have reactions. So if you're a victim of bullying, you're going to have reactions that could be compounded when you're already experiencing trauma. So I think being there to support that student, as well as addressing with the bullies why this is inappropriate, and talking about potentially what was behind their bullying, giving them some access to better ways to communicate experiences and what they're feeling as opposed to bullying can be really helpful as well. Maybe ways to deal with their aggression and that hostility that they're experiencing. But I would say refer to your school administration about what the specific steps that they encourage on the school campus.
And to add to that, I think in working with the victim is really letting them know that the other children are I'm trying to figure out how to say this the right way, because I'm not, it's that part of helping that victim know that it's not their fault. It's not, they're being victimized, they're being bullied because of what the bullies see, what they hear, what they think, and they've place that stigma, they place that label on this child, but the child has, what are the strengths that this child has? What are the things that they're good in? Not to let them be, to be brought down, to feel emotionally beaten up or taken advantage of. It really is that support for that child, that victim, as much as finding the commonalities for the bullies, in letting them know that this is an individual, this is another person who has feelings, emotions, and helping them take to see what they're doing, and that the aggression, the thinking about the specific situation you're saying here is there may be the bullies may be blaming this child because they speak Russian on all the things that the bullies have struggled from because of the country Russia, and have basically made this victim the figurehead. This is the person that they can blame because they speak Russian and Russia has done this to me, and really trying to make them see this child, this victim, as an individual and not representing not being that representative of what they struggled with, what's caused them problems. I hope that helps.
Так, дуже дякую. Останнє запитання. Сьогодні дуже багато запитань. Дякую всім за таку цікавість. Також більш ситуативне, мені здається, воно пов'язане з травмою, можливо, таким способом вираження. Що робити, якщо підліток постійно все фотографує? 100 однакових фото і каже, що не може себе опанувати?
Your thoughts?
I'm just curious about a little bit more details about how that's interfering with the functioning.
I think, as I understand it, that we have an adolescent who has been traumatized, who has undergone a traumatic experience. And one of their reactions, or one of the behaviors that has developed since that event or that experience, is that they're taking a lot of pictures of everything around them. And as Anna was asking, I think the one question that we always ask is, does this behavior cause problems? Is it interfering with their ability to do their schoolwork, to engage with other individuals? Does it inhibit their social skills? Does it become an obsession that they have to take pictures, that it starts to change their ability to for normal development and normal interactions? That would be our first question, is how does this impact the adolescent? If we're finding that it does, if it's like they have this obsession, they have this need to document through pictures, definitely I would say refer to get help at a local mental health facility, a counselor, a psychologist, a social worker. I think when those behaviors become more extreme, when the behaviors an individual starts to do interferes with their life, that's when we say, that's when, as psychologists, we really want to meet with them and start working with them to find ways to help them with that. I think as a teacher, your role, it goes back to our first recommendation, is make that referral to the resources that are available to get them help. I also wonder if, in conversations, talking with them about what ways that they can use this in a positive way. How does it help them? How can they take this this need and use it in a way that's positive but doesn't overtake their life? And thank you.
Дуже дякую. Останнє запитання, таке об'ємне, я б сказала. Я його трішечки скорочу з дозволу автора. Воно звучить так. Скажіть, будь ласка, як убезпечити дитину від вступу до субкультури, якщо ця субкультура характеризується як негативна?
I'm not sure if you asked us a question. We did not get an English translation, so we've missed that last part. Yes, yes. Okay, so help when there's a child or the student is engaging in this subculture that's not good for them. It's a negative subculture. I'm going to say first is have them seek help, because typically behaviors like that are when they engage in these subcultures, when they engage in behaviors that are not expected, not normal, not healthy, the non-healthy types of behaviors, we find that there's typically or normally they're seeking something. They have a need that is not being met normally. Something is missing. And so they may find that by doing these types of behaviors or engaging in a subculture is a way that they get those needs met. They get that support. So one of the warning signs is this loneliness, that they feel isolated. They feel like they don't have anyone that they can talk to. They don't have those friends. And there's this group that of other students or other individuals who are engaged in drug use, and they find this isolated student or individual and bring them in, and now this person starts to find their friendship group, their friends, those that they can connect with. And part of that is by doing drugs, by engaging in this illegal activity. They have that need being met. The need of being around people, being liked, being engaged in socially is met through this subgroup. And so that's where they engage in that. So the question that we would look at from the professional side is what need or what wants or what is missing in their life that this subculture fills. And once we figure out what's missing, then how do we find a way to help that individual with that area that's missing in a positive way rather than in this negative way? I hope that helps.
Дуже вам дякую. Це було останнє запитання. Дуже багато коментарів в чаті також за корисну інформацію, подяк. Дякую, Анна і Рональд, що сьогодні приєдналися до нас. Дякую. Це була для нас дуже велика честь, що ви презентували таку корисну інформацію. Всім учасникам я також хочу ще сказати, що всі презентації, матеріали будуть в вашому доступі. Ви зможете скористуватися матеріалами і англійською версією, і українською версією. І також цього не було зазначено під час презентації, але наприкінці є корисні посилання від наших експертів, так, і вони також будуть у вашому доступі, то ви зможете більш детально дослідити цю тематику. Ще раз всім дякую і тоді до побачення. Побачимося з вами наступного вівторка на новому вебінарі з новими експертами. Дякую за вашу увагу. Всім до побачення.
Велике дякуємо вам. Дуже
Дякуємо,
цікаво.
до побачення.
До побачення.
До побачення.